The luxurious villa with its wide-open windows welcomes the warm golden light from the artistic decorative lamps. Every corner of the room is delicately arranged, reflecting the lifestyle of the wealthy. But no matter how grand and beautiful this villa is, the atmosphere inside is heavy and tense, as if the silence is merely a facade hiding the constant undercurrents of rising turmoil. Brad Pitt, the millionaire husband, stands facing his wife, Sarah Monroe. He is tall, exuding confidence, but his eyes no longer hold the warmth or love that Sarah once saw in them. Instead, there is frustration, discomfort that is hard to hide. His footsteps echo in the living room, each step seeming to weigh down the already quiet space. His wife stands there, unable to conceal the worry in her eyes, but still trying to remain calm. Her words are gentle, as if trying to explain, as if trying to pull him out of the rage overtaking him. "Brad, I just want us to sit down and talk normally. I don't understand why you're so distant. Don't you care about me anymore?" Sarah exclaims, her voice soft and weary. She doesn't know how to salvage their relationship, doesn't know how to make him understand that she just wants to see him happy, that she just wants to be loved and cherished. But before long, in a fit of uncontrollable rage, Brad Pitt suddenly raises his hand and slaps Sarah across the face. The slap echoes like a shock, making the surrounding space seem to pause for a moment. Sarah is pushed back a step, her eyes wide in disbelief at what just happened. She stands there, unable to believe that the man she loves, the husband she has supported wholeheartedly for so many years, could do this to her. That slap is not just a physical act of violence, but a blow to her heart. She cannot understand what could possibly have driven him to do this. Brad, in his fury, does not stop. He continues to point his finger at Sarah, his eyes filled with rage and indignation. "Do you understand? You are the reason everything in my life is falling apart. I don't need a wife like you anymore." Brad's shout cuts through the air like a sharp knife, stabbing straight into Sarah's heart, making her feel like she's being torn apart from the inside. His words, filled with contempt and hurt, are like a wound that may never heal in her soul. She has given everything for this family, endured all hardships and challenges, just to see Brad succeed, but she never expected that all her efforts would mean nothing to him. The close-up shot highlights every detail of that painful moment. The angle of the camera emphasizes the shock in Sarah's eyes, the confusion and the pain that she cannot express in words. Her face blurs with tears, but the light from the ceiling lamp still shines directly on her, creating an image that symbolizes Brad's coldness, the loneliness in his soul. That slap feels like the end of everything, like a final period in a chapter of their lives. The sound of the slap resonates through the space, not only changing the atmosphere but also breaking Sarah's heart, with emotions of conflict that cannot be put into words flooding her mind. The light in the room gradually dims, as if highlighting the cracks in this relationship. The room, though beautiful and luxurious, now feels like a prison, holding all the pain, the resentment, and the unresolved conflicts. The tension rises in the air, and Sarah can only stand there, unable to do anything but try to control her emotions. She doesn't want to cry, doesn't want Brad to see her weakness, but the pain inside her is too great. She once believed that love could overcome all obstacles, but now the truth is a blow too hard for her to bear. This moment, filled with pain and hurt, will forever be a mark that cannot be erased in Sarah's life. She doesn't know what will happen next, but there is one thing she knows for sure. Everything has changed forever. Every day that passes in their lavish mansion is a day full of pressure for Brad Pitt. A man who has it all, a stable career, fame, and wealth. But behind the stage lights and applause, he lives in a world of loneliness, where every expectation from family and society is placed upon him. Brad is the man the world expects to be the perfect role model. Although he is not at fault for being born into a wealthy family, his life feels like an endless string of days, with the weight of expectations always pressing on his shoulders. He knows there is nothing else he can do but continue to pursue the goals that his family and society have set for him. Step by step, he builds his image as a successful and perfect man in the eyes of others. But deep inside, he has never felt satisfied with what he has. Under the light of fame, Brad gradually loses himself. He is no longer a person living with passion and emotion, but merely a shadow of the invisible expectations he cannot reject. He cannot ignore the fact that his family has placed so many expectations on him, making him feel as though he has no choice but to follow their instructions. Every decision, every step in his life is judged through the eyes of those around him, especially his family. To them, he is a source of pride, a shining example for future generations to look up to. But deep within, Brad feels trapped in a golden cage, where everything exists only to please others. However, Brad's exhaustion does not only stem from the expectations of his family and society, but also from his marriage to Sarah Monroe. Sarah, his wife, is a beautiful, intelligent, and devoted woman. She has always been by Brad's side, supporting him through every high and low in his career and life. But throughout many years of living together, Sarah never received the appreciation from Brad that she deserved. She could feel his coldness, the look in his eyes no longer filled with love, the few and distant words he would speak. Sarah understands that Brad loves her, but that love seems to have faded with time, replaced by fatigue, pressure, and never-ending expectations. Sarah had once been the woman Brad cherished deeply. She stood by him in the early days when he had nothing but a dream and a burning desire. But as time went on and Brad's career flourished, Sarah began to feel like a secondary part of his life. She was no longer the one Brad wanted to share his deepest emotions with. They no longer talked about the simple things, no longer laughed together or shared their dreams. Instead, they were two people living under the same roof, but each with their own separate world, distant and unfamiliar. Sarah tried many times to reignite the love between them, but all of it was in vain. Romantic dinners, short trips, nothing could erase the invisible distance between them. Every time she tried to get closer, an invisible wall would rise between them. Brad, although loving her, could not share his worries, his struggles with her. She could feel that distance more than ever, and her heart grew heavier, more lonely. Their marriage seemed like an endless battle. Sarah always had to fight to maintain their relationship, to keep Brad by her side. She had given up so much of her personal life to pursue a life with him, but in the end, she only received exhaustion and indifference from the very man she loved. Sarah began to feel like an indispensable part of Brad's success, but in return, Brad failed to recognize her value. She was the one who had sacrificed so much for him, yet was never properly acknowledged. Many evenings she sat alone in the large room, feeling utterly lonely. She could not remember the last time Brad looked into her eyes and told her he loved her. Each day that passed, her exhaustion grew, and the signs of their distance became more and more evident. Sarah did not want to believe their marriage was headed for a dead end, but she could not avoid facing the truth. She realized that Brad's love was no longer the same kind of love she once knew. He had changed, not because he no longer loved her, but because he had grown weary of the expectations he had to bear. He had become a man of the public, a role model everyone admired, but he was no longer the man she had once loved. Both Brad and Sarah were struggling with emotions and expectations they could not meet. Brad was tired of being unable to escape the shadow of perfection that society and his family had placed upon him, while Sarah felt lonely, unloved, and unappreciated. The inner conflicts of both were gradually pushing them further apart, and they could do nothing to change the situation. Their relationship, once filled with joy and happiness, was now a life of exhaustion, with no understanding or true love. They both felt trapped in roles assigned by society, and they could not find a way out. In a world of fame and money, they were still just simple people, with relationships full of conflict and emotions repressed. Sarah loved Brad, but she could not continue living in a marriage that no longer held love. Brad loved Sarah, but he could not see that she was the only one who could make him truly happy. The inner conflicts within them were not just a story of a marriage, but a story of change, of values lost in this life. Sarah Monroe stood in the living room of the house she and Brad had built together, gazing out the window where raindrops fell steadily, as if to match the surging waves of emotions building inside her. Everything in her life seemed to have changed since she discovered the truth about Brad. Her heart, once full of trust and hope, now felt like a crushed flower. The sensation came suddenly and painfully, leaving her unable to control herself. Every moment, she could distinctly feel the strange emptiness in her heart. It wasn't due to a lack of material wealth or success in life, but because of the lack of affection, the absence of sweet words, firm handshakes, and the feeling of being truly loved. Everything she once believed in now lay in pieces. For Sarah, love and family had always been inseparable. She had poured all her affection and heart into this marriage, believing that love would be the only force that could bring everything together, helping them overcome all difficulties. But now, as she stood facing Brad, the man she loved and had devoted herself to, she began to realize that things were no longer the same. The tender looks, the sweet words she once received from him, now seemed to be nothing more than illusions, cold signs she could not understand. There was no more closeness, no more sharing, only the terrifying silence between them. Brad was no longer the man she once loved, and now she didn't know how to save what remained. Day by day, Sarah still tried to hold on to peaceful moments, the old habits she and Brad once shared. She still cooked delicious meals, took care of the house, tried to create a cozy space. But all those efforts seemed like water poured on a taro leaf. She felt the exhaustion, the failure spreading inside her, because no matter how hard she tried, it seemed impossible to keep the heart of the husband she had always been devoted to. Every evening, when they sat in the living room, looking at each other but not saying a word, she could feel the coldness in his eyes. Not the look of love and encouragement, but a distant gaze, full of contemplation, as if he were somewhere far away, a place Sarah could never reach. Every time she tried to talk, every time she longed for a simple conversation, he would avoid it, locking himself in a world Sarah couldn't understand. On a rainy evening, while Sarah was tidying up Brad's office, a habit she still maintained even though she knew he no longer paid attention to her, she accidentally discovered a letter hidden in the drawer. It was folded carefully, but unlike ordinary letters, it had an old, worn appearance, as if it had been kept with special care. The letter, though not addressed to anyone, radiated an aura of seriousness in every fold. Sarah opened it gently, her heart filled with worry, but unable to stop herself, as if an invisible force pulled her to it. "I love you," the letter began, and in that moment, Sarah felt her heart tighten. These words she had once heard from Brad, now appeared in a different context. A context she never imagined would happen. Brad, the husband she had always trusted and loved, had written these words to another woman. These words were like thorns piercing her heart, each one cutting the bonds she had for him. She read on, each word, each sentence, as if time had stopped. In the letter, Brad confessed his feelings for a woman Sarah had never known, someone she never imagined would appear in her life. The love Brad had for her seemed sincere and passionate, full of promises, sweet emotions, all of which were different from what he had shown to Sarah throughout the years. The pain felt like a sharp knife slicing through her heart. Tears streamed down Sarah's face, but she no longer had the strength to cry out loud. She felt as though she were sinking into a deep abyss, a place with no escape. The doubts in her heart were now confirmed, and no matter how bitter the truth, she could not stop. How could Brad do this to her? How could he deceive her so cruelly? Sarah asked herself in confusion, but she couldn't answer. She couldn't comprehend. couldn't explain this change. Everything she had believed in, everything she had tried to protect, now seemed to have disappeared. Suddenly, all the signs she had ignored now appeared clearer than ever. She recalled the times Brad came home late, the calls that were never properly explained, the evenings he sat silently in his office without wanting to talk to her. Sarah had tried to push those uneasy feelings out of her mind, but now, with the letter in hand, everything exploded in her mind. She had convinced herself that everything was just a misunderstanding, that Brad's actions were simply due to stressful work, to the pressures he had to endure. But now, with this letter, all the uneasiness she had felt turned into reality. Their relationship was no longer the sweet love, no longer the strong family she had hoped for. It had been gradually eroded, destroyed by deception and secrets that Brad had tried to hide. Sarah sat down on the chair, too weak to stand up anymore. She felt as though she were lost in a world that didn't belong to her. Everything she had hoped for, everything she had tried to build, now felt like a sandcastle, swept away by the wind in an instant. She thought about the beautiful memories between the two of them, about the times they laughed together, the warm evenings, but none of it could compare to the coldness of the present. That love, which she had once trusted, now was nothing but a wound in her soul, a memory she could never forget. The images of Brad, of the sweet moments in the past, now only remained as cracks, memories that could never be healed. The letter, although it had ended, left a deep scar in Sarah's heart. She didn't know if she could continue living in this relationship. How could she continue to love a man who had betrayed her like this? How could she face the truth that the husband she loved was no longer the man she once knew? That question kept swirling in Sarah's mind, preventing her from finding an answer. She didn't know if there was still love in their relationship, but one thing was certain: she couldn't live in lies. In the silence of the room, Sarah looked up and gazed out the window. The rain still fell steadily, as if it sympathized with the sorrow in her heart. The raindrops outside seemed to merge with her tears, as if the world around her understood the pain she was going through. But then, in that moment, a strange sensation began to spread within her. A feeling of determination, of the need to uncover the truth, no matter how painful it might be. She could no longer live in the darkness of deception. She needed to face the truth, even if it was something she never wanted. Sarah had spent many long nights in contemplation, wondering if what she had thought about Brad was the truth, if she could trust him again. She knew something was wrong, but her heart could not accept the harsh truth. Everything had become blurry, hazy, like a nightmare, where she always tried to find an escape route, but couldn't see clearly. The love, the happiness, and the beautiful memories that she and Brad had built together now crumbled before her eyes. Sarah felt as though she was drowning in a sea of chaotic emotions, between pain, disappointment, and anger that she couldn't contain. Finally, the truth came to Sarah like an unavoidable storm. She discovered Brad's affair, a relationship he had tried to hide, not just from her, but from the world around them. She never imagined that deceit could go this far, and she never expected the person she trusted and loved the most to be the one to make her face this painful truth. Every piece of the trust and respect she had given him was torn into fragments, impossible to mend. The dreams of a future together, of a happy life she had envisioned, now lay broken like shattered glass, irreparable. Sarah stood facing Brad, her heart choking as each word, each sentence from their seemingly harmless conversations now echoed in her mind. "I love you. We'll grow old together." All those words now felt like lies, full of contradictions and not real. How could she continue to trust a man whose ideals were just a game of deception? How could she keep looking at him with admiration when inside him was a stranger she no longer recognized? Anger and pain swelled inside her. She could feel the hurt like a wave crashing against her heart, each wave a beautiful memory of him, now fading into darkness. But amid the chaos, a strong decision began to spark within her. She could not continue to live in this lie. She could not allow herself to be tortured by his sweet words and his insincere actions anymore. She could no longer be the woman blindly believing the promises he made. No more meaningless tears, no more endurance that broke her down. She needed to confront him, not to apologize, but to reclaim the right to live freely, to be loved fully and sincerely. She walked towards Brad, her gaze no longer weak, but filled with a fierce determination. She did not want to hide anymore, did not want to remain his shadow. The exhaustion had pushed her to the limits of endurance. She would not let him control her anymore, would not let him manipulate her emotions. She did not want to live in a world of lies, did not want to live in a relationship without love, only with cracks and wounds. But as she got closer, a chilling sensation flooded the room. Brad stood there, expressionless, his eyes cold as if everything she had gone through didn't deserve his attention. He stood there, still maintaining the image of a perfect man in society's eyes, unshaken, like a rigid statue with no change in his gaze. This was how he protected himself from the world, with an impenetrable exterior, with the mask he always wore to hide his own weakness. And then, as she approached, he did not hesitate to raise his hand and grip her wrist forcefully. In that moment, all the emotions inside her surged. He pulled her closer, as if to overpower her, as if to show her that he could still control everything, still manipulate all her emotions. Insulting words continued to pour from his mouth, each word like a sharp knife stabbing into her heart. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. How could this be, when the man she had trusted treated her like this? Sarah stood still, feeling the strength and anger in his arm. But she knew this was the moment she needed to awaken. The pain, the fear suddenly disappeared, replaced by a new feeling, one of power, one of control. This was her moment to stand up, to no longer be the woman who endured, to no longer be a victim of lies and hurt. She realized that, right in this moment, she could take control of her own life. The dim light in the room, from the faint yellow lamps, seemed to reflect Sarah's despair. The entire space seemed to be enveloped in a gloomy color, a color of loss and pain. But amidst all the darkness, light still existed. Sarah looked into Brad's eyes, and she did not see the confidence, did not see the strength he had tried to portray. Instead, she saw the weakness, the fear he never dared to face. He had lived his whole life in self-deceit, unable to accept his true self. A new feeling began to rise in Sarah. She was no longer the woman who endured in the darkness of lies. She decided that she would no longer live in patience, in the shattered pieces of trust that had been broken. She would stand up. She would face the truth, not just with Brad, but with herself. She would not let anyone hurt her anymore. Her determination created a moment of change. The light in the room gradually faded, leaving only silence and darkness enveloping everything. But in that moment, a new spark of light flickered within her. Sarah knew she had found the strength to move forward. No more fear, no more hesitation. She had decided to leave behind everything that had dragged her down. Each step Sarah took echoed distinctly in the lavish mansion she and Brad had built together many years ago. These footsteps sounded like the noise of exhaustion, of a breaking point. Sarah looked around, feeling as though every corner of the house was turning into cold walls, pushing her further away from herself. She had once loved this house, had once seen it as the warmest place, full of beautiful memories with the man she had trusted and given her heart to. But now, the atmosphere in every room felt heavy, as if her love no longer had a place here. The warm yellow light from the lamps reflected on the paintings hanging on the walls. But in Sarah's eyes, everything seemed like foreign, soulless objects. Everything seemed to lose its meaning. She looked at herself in the bathroom mirror and saw a woman she no longer recognized. She was no longer Sarah with bright eyes, a gentle smile, and a burning passion. She was now a tired woman, emotionally drained, lost in painful and vague thoughts about the future. Every feature on her face, every small wrinkle at the corners of her eyes, reflected the exhaustion she had endured. The feeling of loss was not because of Brad's betrayal, but because she felt forgotten. That feeling smoldered inside her like a deep wound that could never heal. But what would happen if she continued to live in a marriage without true love? How could she continue to sacrifice, continue to love a man who no longer cared for her, who no longer saw the value in the devotion she had given him? How could she continue to live invisibly in his eyes, as if she were just a decoration in Brad's life full of ambition and expectations? Sarah knew that she couldn't keep doing this. She couldn't live as a shadow in her own life. During these painful days, Sarah began to seek an escape. She no longer saw herself in this relationship. She couldn't accept a life suffocated by lies, by the feelings of abandonment and neglect. She began to plan for a future without Brad, for a life where she wouldn't have to depend on anyone to feel her own worth. This life might be difficult. It might be lonely, but at least it would be a life she could choose, a life she could control. Sarah no longer wanted to be the woman behind Brad's career and fame. She didn't want to be the wife he considered a secondary part of his life. She wanted to be herself, to live with the passion and dreams she had long neglected. And in those darkest days, when she looked at herself in the mirror, she knew she could do it. She could find strength from within, no matter how challenging the path ahead might be. Eventually, the family gathering happened, and it was the first time Sarah saw clearly the change in her relationship with Brad. Everything was no longer as it once was, and the atmosphere that evening, when the whole family gathered, only highlighted the increasing tension in their relationship. Sarah sat there, in her elegant dress, but the feeling inside her was indescribable. Everything around her seemed to blur, leaving only Brad, the man she once loved more than anyone. Now the person she could no longer understand. Brad, with his tired and heavy gaze, finally began to share the pressures he had been facing. His words Sarah never thought he would say, poured out like an unending downpour. He spoke of the enormous expectations from his family, friends, and society, of the unreasonable desires he couldn't fulfill. "You don't understand, Sarah," Brad began, his voice low, as if the weight of the world was on his shoulders. "Everyone always sees me as a role model, a perfect man, but you don't understand that I can't be everything they expect. I'm so tired of these never-ending expectations." Sarah listened, but inside, she no longer felt any sympathy. The words Brad spoke sounded like excuses for his actions. She had once empathized, once thought he would realize what he was doing wrong. But now, she only saw irresponsibility, blame, and a lack of heart in him. The pressures Brad had to endure could not be an excuse for him to avoid his responsibilities to his family. He could not use those reasons to dismiss the emotions Sarah had given him, nor could he use them to continue to distance himself from her, to keep deceiving and hurting her. "So it's all my fault, right?" Sarah exclaimed, her eyes glistening with pain. She felt a lump in her throat as she spoke these words, but they had to be said. "You're tired of everyone's expectations, but why aren't you tired of the lack of affection in this family? Why aren't you tired of neglecting your wife, the one who has always been by your side?" Her voice was full of hurt, disappointment, but also a sense of determination. Sarah could no longer live in the shadow of deception. She could no longer love a man who didn't appreciate her, a man who always found ways to avoid the responsibilities he had to shoulder. Brad sat there, silent. He didn't say anything, just gripped his wine glass tightly. The whole room seemed to pause in that moment. Sarah looked into Brad's eyes, but she no longer saw the warmth, the love she had once received. She saw a man who was afraid, a man who couldn't face the truth inside him. And in that moment, Sarah realized that she couldn't continue living in a relationship full of fear, lacking love and respect. She stood up, looked at Brad one last time, but didn't say anything more. She turned away and walked out of the room as if it were the last time she would step foot in this place. She didn't know what her future would hold, but she knew that she would find herself again. She wouldn't let betrayal and the lack of affection ruin her life. She would walk forward, even if alone, but with a heart full of hope. Sarah walked with an indescribable weariness. Every step she took in the luxurious villa she had once cherished now felt like it was pulling her into an unknown journey, a journey with no way out. She no longer recognized herself in this life, no longer recognized the relationship between her and Brad, between her and the family she had once given her heart to. The feeling of betrayal did not only come from Brad, but also from those who had helped her build this life, those she had trusted the most. In the days following the confrontation with Brad, Sarah could not find peace. She began seeking answers to questions she had never dared to face before. The questions spiraled in her mind, and the signs of betrayal seemed to appear clearer than ever. How could Brad become a person she no longer recognized? How could the man she had loved be so cold, only caring for himself and the invisible expectations his family imposed on him? But what confused her even more was the feeling that she had been deceived, not only by Brad but also by his family. She needed to know the truth, no matter how painful it was. One day, as she was cleaning Brad's study, Sarah found an old box carefully hidden in a drawer. This box was not like the usual items around the house. It looked old, covered in dust, as if it had been lying still for years. Sarah didn't know why, but an invisible force compelled her to open the box. When she opened it, inside was a collection of documents, letters, and contracts she had never seen before. These papers seemed very important, but one of them made Sarah stop. It was an old letter, folded many times, with a seal that was no longer clear. Sarah pulled it out and began to read. The words in that letter made her feel like the ground beneath her feet was crumbling. In it, a member of Brad's family, someone she had considered close, wrote dark words. The letter revealed that Brad's family had forced him to marry her, Sarah Monroe, not because of love, but for financial and social gain. This was an arranged marriage from the start, an unspoken agreement between Brad's family and hers, aimed at maintaining the facade of a perfect family, entirely for commercial and social purposes. The more she read, the more overwhelmed Sarah became. Every word, every sentence in the letter seemed to tear her heart into pieces. The sacrifices she had made, the devotion she had given to Brad and his family, turned out to be just part of a bigger plan she had never known. She had thought love was everything, that she was the ideal partner he needed. But now, the truth forced her to face another reality. She was just a pawn in Brad's family's power game. When Sarah finished reading the letter, she felt like everything around her was spinning. She couldn't understand why Brad had never told her about this secret. Why hadn't he given her a chance to understand the pressures he was under from his family? She had loved him with all her heart, but now, all she had was betrayal and concealment. She felt like she had been deceived from the beginning. Every moment in this marriage had been overshadowed by lies and schemes, and Sarah could not accept that. One night, when Sarah could no longer tolerate the secrets, she decided to confront Brad. She could not live in the shadows of these secrets, could not continue to be controlled by the pressures from his family. She had to find out the truth, and she decided to ask him once more, directly and without evasion. Sarah was prepared for any answer, no matter how painful the truth was. When facing Brad, the tension in the air was palpable. Sarah was no longer the weak woman Brad thought she was. She was ready to face the things she had never dared to ask before. She looked at Brad, her eyes filled with determination and strength. "Brad," she began, her voice unwavering, steady and sure. "I know everything. I know about your family, the pressures you've been under, about this marriage. But what I cannot accept is the deceit. Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you give me a chance to understand what you've been going through?" Brad could not hide the confusion in his eyes. He hadn't thought Sarah would uncover the truth, and now, as he faced her, he felt like all the walls he had built were collapsing. His feelings were like a trapped animal caught in its own snare. He looked at Sarah, and in that moment, he realized that no matter how much he tried to hide the truth, he could not deceive her heart. "Sarah," Brad began, his voice full of pain, "you don't understand. I had no choice. My family forced me to marry you. They don't care about love. They only care about reputation, about finances. I've been trapped in this life, and I don't know what to do to escape. Brad's words were like a knife stabbing straight into Sarah's heart. She had thought she was the most important person in Brad's life, that her love for him was enough to overcome any obstacle. But now, she realized that everything she had believed in was an illusion. Brad's family didn't care about love, and neither did he. He didn't truly love her, at least not in the way she loved him. She was part of a bigger plan, a plan she had never been told about. All of this made Sarah feel like her world was crumbling. She could no longer live in a marriage where everything was a lie. She could not love a man she no longer trusted. But amidst all the chaos and pain, Sarah realized one important thing. She did not have to live this way anymore. She did not have to continue sacrificing, continue accepting the deceit. She had the right to choose her life, the right to find freedom and happiness again. Brad, standing opposite Sarah in the dimly lit room, felt like he was being pushed into a dead end. He didn't know how to heal the wounds he had caused her, and the truth about his family, about this marriage, was now a burden he could not bear. The day Brad faced his family was like an unavoidable confrontation, a battle not only for personal freedom, but also a struggle for the core values he had neglected for so many years. The tension reached its peak. Each step he took seemed to lead him down a path shrouded in fog, one he could never turn back from. The image of him, once carefully built within perfect frameworks, was now being torn apart in his own life. His heart pounded harder than ever, like a call from deep within, a call to break free from the shackles he had bound himself with his whole life. Brad's family, the people he had always trusted and obeyed, continued to vehemently oppose his relationship with Sarah. Every time he faced them, he felt the pressure from their cold words and the disdain in their eyes. The suspicious questions, the sharp criticisms, all were meant to affirm that he had no right to choose his own life. "You can't throw away everything we've built," his mother said, her voice laced with disappointment and anger. "You can't lose this family just for a woman who has nothing but love." His father, who always held an arrogant view of fame and power, did not hesitate to emphasize, "Do you think a relationship like this will get you anywhere? A life of wealth, power, and influence are things you'll lose if you follow your heart." Brad felt their words like heavy stones crashing into his soul. Each of their words was like a knife to his heart. But the most painful part was the truth that they did not understand him. They did not understand that he was no longer the obedient son following orders. He was no longer the son willing to sacrifice everything to satisfy the expectations of his family, of society. He had once thought he could live in the shadow of those expectations, but now he realized that very shadow had consumed him, suffocating all his hopes and dreams. The more he listened to their words, the more he felt their coldness in every sentence, the more he felt lost. The relationship between him and his family, which he had always considered a solid foundation, now became the very thing that imprisoned him, making him feel as if he was living someone else's life. He had once tried to preserve this family, protect the values they imposed, but now he realized that all it did was make him lose himself. He had sacrificed so much, but in the end, he did not receive the love he deserved. And when he faced Sarah, he realized that she was the only one who did not box him in, who did not demand that he be someone he could never become. She loved him because he was him, not because he was a part of a powerful family or a social symbol. At that moment, Brad knew he could no longer live this lie. He could not continue to do what his family wanted, living a life without true love. Sarah had shown him that life was not just about fame and power. True love, the freedom to love, was something he had neglected for too long. And in that moment, Brad decided that he would not let the pressures of his family and society control his life any longer. He could not continue to live as a puppet, unable to live without his own heart. After a few moments of deep thought, Brad stood up, faced his family, and made a decision no one could have anticipated. He looked into their eyes, and for the first time in his life, he felt no fear. "I cannot continue living the life you've planned for me," he said, his voice firm but full of emotion. "I cannot live just because you want me to. I will not continue doing what you expect. I will not continue living in a relationship without true love." Everything in the room seemed to quiet down. The silence so deep that the breathing of everyone could be heard. His family, who had always prided themselves on what they had, now was left in silence. They could not believe what Brad had just said. Everything, all the plans, all the dreams they had spent their lives building were now being pushed out the window. A life no longer dependent on money, no longer based on fame, no longer bound by expectations. A life that Brad decided to start from his own heart. "I will leave," Brad said, each word breaking the silence like the shattering of glass, the end of a chapter in his life. "I will live the way I want, even if I lose everything. Fame, fortune, everything you consider important. I will give it all up, because I cannot continue living in a relationship that has no true love." Sarah, standing at a distance, looked at Brad with eyes full of empathy and understanding. She knew that this decision would not be easy for him, but she also knew that this was the moment they had to face the truth, face themselves. Sarah did not need any words. She just needed to look into his eyes and understand that he had chosen his path. He had chosen true love, had chosen to live truthfully with himself, and although the road ahead would be difficult, she knew he had found the strength to live the life he deserved. Although his family might be angry, might be disappointed, Brad was no longer afraid. He was no longer the man they wanted him to be. He had decided to become himself, and to Sarah, this was the most precious thing he could do, not for the family or society, but for himself and their love. Finally, Brad walked out of the room without looking back. Everything seemed to have changed. And in that moment, Sarah knew that their road would not be easy, but at least they would no longer have to live in the molds others had created for them. They would live the life they deserved, with love and true freedom. When the door to Sarah and Brad's marriage closed, an indescribable silence enveloped the vast space of the mansion that had once been their home. Every step they took in this house felt heavy, like shackles restraining their souls. The choice to stop, to let go, seemed inevitable. This was not the end of a simple love story, but the end of a chapter in their lives, where everything they had built now lay in ruins, the broken pieces of what once seemed perfect. Sarah stood alone in the large living room, where she and Brad had once shared so many joys and sorrows. Everything remained the same, yet nothing was as it had been. Every corner of this house was now filled with sad memories, moments that could never be relived. She looked at the photographs on the walls, the paintings that once reflected the love she had for Brad, but now they were just relics of a past life she no longer wanted to remember. She knew now was the time to leave. She could not stay here, could not continue living in a space shrouded by falsehoods, by the secrets Brad had kept hidden all this time. The mansion that Sarah and Brad had once shared was no longer a safe place, no longer a place where she could feel love. She looked at her actions in the mirror, her deep eyes full of determination, yet there was still something bewildered in them, as if she hadn't fully accepted the truth. Divorce was a decision she could no longer avoid, but it still made her heart ache. Walking away from this relationship, she would have to face a completely different world, one where she no longer had Brad, no longer had the protection of his family, and no longer had the warmth of a love she had always longed for. But Sarah knew it was the right choice. She could not continue living in a life without freedom, without true love. She wanted to find herself again, to live a life where no one or nothing held her back, where she no longer had to endure the expectations and pressures from a family she had never truly belonged to. She wanted to be herself, an independent woman, free and not dependent on anyone. Brad, faced with Sarah's decision, could not help but feel a deep emptiness within his heart. He stood alone in his office, where he had spent countless hours planning for the family's future, for projects he hoped would elevate him to new heights. But now, everything had changed. He looked at the desk, where only papers and contracts remained, documents he no longer had the mind to care about. It seemed that everything in his life had become meaningless. When he realized he had lost the woman he loved, the woman who had been by his side through all the storms. The feeling of loss hit Brad like a great wave. all the success, all the fame he had built over the years, now felt insignificant when faced with the reality that he had lost true love in his life. He looked at their pictures of Sarah and felt a pain he couldn't describe. How could he let everything come to this? How could he hurt the woman he had loved for so many years? The answer was not within him, as he didn't know what to do to heal Sarah's wounds or to save a marriage he had failed to preserve. But in his confusion and pain, Brad realized something important. He had lived his whole life under the pressure of family and society, forgetting the true values of life. He had not realized that love, care, and sincerity were the most important things. He had allowed fame and these invisible expectations to dominate his life. And now, when faced with loss, he realized that he couldn't turn back time. What he had lost could not be regained. Sarah and Brad decided to divorce, each finding their own path. It was a painful decision, but it was the only one that could help them find themselves again. Sarah, though filled with sorrow, remained steadfast in her resolve. She knew that freedom didn't come from waiting, but from action, from standing up and creating a new life for herself. She no longer had to live in the shadows of secrets, of lies. She would not let the past continue to control her life. Though the path ahead might be full of difficulties and challenges, she believed that she could overcome it all. For now, she had herself. Brad, after the divorce from Sarah, also began to feel a significant change in his life. He left behind wealth, fame, and everything he had once had to seek a life where he could truly live as himself. He was no longer bound by family, no longer governed by the expectations of others. He realized that, sometimes, to find freedom, we must give up things we thought would make us happy. But true happiness is not about what we have, but what we feel inside. And then, in the days that followed, although they had parted ways, Sarah and Brad both realized that their decision, no matter how painful, had opened a new door, a new opportunity for them to find true happiness. Sarah, though facing the hardships of a new life, felt freer than ever. She was living true to herself, living the way she wanted. She found joy in the simple things, in her work, in new relationships, and in herself. Brad, after months of reflection and self-examination, also found peace in his heart. Though Sarah was no longer by his side, he realized that finding freedom, learning to live with himself, was the most important thing. He was no longer caught up in the vortex of fame and money. He learned how to face pain and accept it as part of life. He had found happiness in the freedom he had never had before. The lives of both, though no longer together, became full of meaning. Each had found their own path, and in that, they realized that their choices, though painful and challenging, ultimately led them to a life of true happiness and freedom. Life is a series of choices, and each choice carries with it a story, a journey full of challenges, pain, but also hope and dreams. There are times when we stand at a major crossroads in life, where everything seems to be distorted, where we feel lost amidst the expectations and judgments of society and family. But sometimes, it is precisely in those moments, when everything is collapsing, that we find the strength to stand up, to assert our own freedom, to find happiness, and to live a life we truly deserve. The story of Sarah and Brad is not just a story of love, but also a story of the struggle to break free from the constraints of society, family, and oneself. They had to face unimaginable challenges, massive pressures from their family and society, and they did what few dared to do. They chose the path of freedom, the path of living according to their own hearts, even if that meant giving up the most valuable things that society taught them to pursue. In the end, after all the storms and turmoil, Sarah stood at the door, looking toward the horizon, feeling the freedom she had never dared to dream of. It was a moment that could not be expressed in words. It could only be felt through the heart, through the stillness in the soul. It was the moment when she knew that she had truly broken free from the shackles of the past, that she had decided to live for herself, to live according to the values she believed in, without having to please anyone. without having to meet anyone's expectations. We can clearly see that in this life, too many people live a life that is not their own. A life where they are nothing more than puppets in the hands of family, friends, and society's expectations. They are caught up in the vortex of prejudices, judgments they can never escape. They chase after money, fame, or values imposed by others, and then forget that life is not a competition for external recognition. Life only makes sense when we live true to ourselves, when we dare to look at ourselves and ask, am I living the life I want to live? Sarah had once lived in a world where her decisions were not entirely her own. Her relationship with Brad, his family, all of it had been built on expectations she never set for herself. She had lived in patience, in things society deemed right. But one day, she realized that this had been holding her back. She could not continue to live in the shadows of those expectations. She could not live a life where she was not the one making decisions. And when she stepped outside the door, that was the moment she chose freedom, chose the life she deserved, even if the road ahead was full of challenges. Freedom, truly, is not about being able to do whatever we want, but about living a life that is not bound by the invisible strings of expectations. It is about finding ourselves in this world, in the decisions we make, in the paths we choose. Just like Brad, he realized that life is not just about success, money, or fame. Life only truly matters when he can live true to himself, when he can love without being tortured by the expectations placed upon him by family and society. This does not mean that career, fame, or material possessions are not important. We live in a society where sometimes these values are seen as the measure of success. But we must remember that success is not something that can be measured by money or fame, but by being satisfied with who we are, by having the ability to live the life we choose, not the life others want us to live. When Sarah stepped outside, when she looked toward the horizon, she felt that her life had changed forever. She was no longer the woman bound by lies, no longer the one caught in the power games of family and society. She was herself, free in her decisions, her actions, and her love. It was a wonderful liberation, not just physically, but also mentally. She had found a strength she had never known, a power that comes from within, which only when we live true to ourselves can we truly feel. The message of this story is a powerful reminder to all of us. Never lose yourself for the expectations of society. Do not let money, fame, or societal standards decide your life. Freedom comes from living according to your own heart, from standing up and saying, I will live my life, not the life that others want me to live. That is the life we truly deserve. And that is the message Sarah sent to everyone struggling to find themselves in a world full of pressures and prejudices. In the end, each of us has our own story, our own journey, but we can all learn an important lesson. Freedom and happiness do not come from external things, but from within, from the choices we make, and the courage to live true to ourselves. And when we do that, when we live a life not influenced by expectations and prejudices, that is when we find true freedom. When Sarah stepped outside the door, when she looked toward the vast horizon, she didn't just see a new future, but also saw a life she had never dared to dream of, a life full of freedom and promise. She knew that no matter how difficult the road ahead might be, she would no longer be afraid, for she had found her greatest strength, personal freedom, and true love. Her story, like Brad's, is a testament to the strength of humanity when we dare to stand up and live the life we truly desire, unimpeded by prejudices or external expectations.